So hi everybody, my name is Jonathan Jardis. I'm an intern here at Sports Philanthropy Network. I want to welcome you all to the board development panel. And with that, I will pass it over to Melissa, who will be our moderator today.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Melissa Glossop, and I am on the board of Sports Philanthropy Network. And we are here to welcome two amazing women in the nonprofit and business space. Let me begin with Elizabeth Finlayson. She is an amazing woman. She started off as an actress and wanted to be the first trillionaire who really made an impact in the world. And she became a master of storytelling. And through her ability to tell stories, she was able to create her niche in the nonprofit world. So Elizabeth, if you will unmute and if you would give a little bit of hello and welcome about yourself.
Hello. Well, I've been in the nonprofit sector since a little bit before September 11th, 2001. So I have fundraised through 3 recessions now. Yay. But I have a mission to create a fairer, more equitable world filled with empathy and beauty. And so every day I get to live that through this work with all of you and all these nonprofits. And so it's really exciting.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. We also have Melissa Legowski with us here today. She is a firecracker in the nonprofit and corporate space. She has raised over $6 million from various different programs. She's also a coordinator and organizer for such things in the Chicago area, such as RibFest, which boasted a 70,000 person attendee. You've done many, many things across the span of your career. Melissa, will you unmute and give a quick welcome to our fantastic guests?
Thank you so much. Happy to be here. And yeah, so I started my fundraising and my love of nonprofits when I was about 12 years old and had a carnival in my backyard, and then went on to do all things nonprofit. And I had my first role as an executive director in 1999. I became the executive director for a small organization on the north side of Chicago, which had at the time 225 members. We were hosting 24 events a year, 12 newsletters, 8 committees, and I was a staff of 1 with a very old school board of directors. I unfortunately got burnt out and went to corporate America, where I was miserable. And so then I returned to the nonprofit space to start Big Buzz Idea Group. And Big Buzz Idea Group knows that many nonprofit executives lack the time, staff, skills, and funding that they need to thrive and succeed. So we fill in gaps in management, marketing, and events to help organizations stay focused on the big picture and position their organization to thrive. So I'm excited to be here today and share our knowledge to help other nonprofits flourish.
Thank you, ladies. So getting us kicked off for this session, obviously we're focusing on board development. So I'm going to ask you the first question. How do you define the role of a board, and how should someone either starting off or wanting to level up address the concept of managing a board and what those roles may entail?
That's such a great question. I think the place that I would want to start with this is really looking at the full board role. A lot of times what happens when people get recruited onto a board and then they're in that role, they know they have to show up at meetings, maybe, hopefully. They know that there's some things they have to do, and then there's a lot of conversation about fundraising and money. But there's a lot that gets skipped in that. And I think one of the things we really want to do is kind of take a step back and look at that full board role. Obviously, fundraising is critically important, but it's not the only role. The really first role of a board member is looking at governance and compliance. So are you ensuring the legal and ethical accountability of the organization? Are you following the laws of your state? Are you following the federal laws? Are you following your bylaws? Have you looked at your bylaws in a while? Is that something that your board members have? These are all really important things. Are we ensuring effective organizational planning? This is really, really important. The other second area is mission. So I think for a lot of us, we're like, oh yeah, mission, that's the thing that was on there, then we signed up. But where it becomes more of a living and breathing thing is that as a board member, are we looking at the programs and the new ideas that are coming up from the staff or the executive director or another board member and saying, hey, does that really fit our mission? Or does our mission still state what we're doing? Or have we started to kind of drift off a little bit? Now, there's nothing wrong with revising that mission statement. In fact, you should do that maybe every few years, but you really want to make sure that what you're doing and that mission, they fit together. A third area that gets totally overlooked is HR. So we need to be hiring and supporting our chief executive as a partner in assessing their performance. We need to be ensuring staff oversight and morale. Now, this does not mean like we're getting in there, we're saying like, you need to send 4 letters today. We're not getting down to that level. It's really this higher level perspective, right? But if you're getting a ton of staff turnover or your executive director is really burned out, it's not like, oh, I feel so bad for you. You know, this is our job as board members to making sure that we're helping that executive director to grow and get the support and resources they need. And then finally, that really important role that we do talk about so often is providing financial oversight as well as the adequate resources. So if you're on that board and you don't know how to read your financials, if you don't know how to understand those budgets, ask those questions. Feel free to look stupid, but get in there and get that information. You don't, as a board member, want to be sitting there and not really understanding that. You can get yourself and your organization in a lot of trouble by not understanding those critical functions.
Melissa, what are your thoughts?
I really think that Elizabeth covered it very well. You know, I do think there's a lot more that goes into that than you might first realize. I think as you start to understand that role, that then the next step in really building the successful board is outlining your expectations. And, you know, with that, I think lots of times boards don't realize the amount of work that goes into pre-planning. And to that point, the more you can outline job descriptions for the roles on your board, the more that you can outline the expectations and get really clear about the amount of time required, the days and times of the meetings. Do they need to come to every event? Do they only have to come to certain fundraising events? You know, understand kind of what the expectation is for weekends, because maybe they have a job where they travel a lot and that's automatically going to preclude them from being a good board member. So I think setting out clear expectations, the number of board meetings, do they have to serve on a committee? Are there table purchases? Do you have a give or get on sponsorship, you know, that they have to be responsible for? What other kind of fundraising support might be part of that process? You know, do they need to contribute a certain number of volunteers over the course of their service? And what about being an ambassador to the organization? If you can define that and really give them some clear-cut black and white outlines, I feel like you start to be able to communicate better with your potential candidates through the nomination process to really just help them know what you're expecting, because when you can be that clear, they're going to be able to say yes or no more effectively, and they're going to be able to serve your organization at a much higher level.
So you touched on a very critical word, and I believe communication is a critical piece of board management, governance, and evolving. So what can you say about communication and how critical that is in managing boards?
Yeah, I think hands down, I just, you know, every presentation I ever give, it comes back to communication. I think communication is something that is paramount to success. And I think everybody feels that they have good communication. And I feel that we always could do better, no matter how good you are. You know, we can't control how others hear what we're saying. And so that's part of the whole checklist that I'm outlining on expectations. The best boards really put it in a document that's shared on the front end and referred back to, but you've got to communicate on a regular cadence. You've got to know the level of details. I think in the nonprofit space, we often get so close to a project that we think everybody knows what we know, and they don't, because they're not looking at it as intimately as we are. So really making sure that you have reports and updates and ongoing channels of communication and ways for people to plug in, I think that that makes a huge difference in the level of success that any organization feels. Elizabeth, what are your thoughts? You've worked with an awful lot of groups as well.
Well, first, I was about to say, Melissa, I think you're totally 100% dead on, with what you're saying about setting expectations. That is part of that communication. I feel like I'm often in with nonprofit staff members who are going to whisper to me those complaints about the board members, and oftentimes I can trace it back to that beginning where we're setting expectations, or I think most accurately, not setting expectations, or letting people off the hook on those expectations, or not really having a thorough process around that. And so I think that communication is really critical. And I think when Melissa's saying here about communication, it is true. When we get really close to our projects, we do think that they know. I also find people should our board members a lot. Well, they should know, they should have been there. It's like, but they didn't, or they're not. So how do we get from where we're at to where we want them to be, rather than like, well, they're terrible. It's like, well, that's not going to get you anywhere. So yeah, I think that communication, you guys are right on.
Well, and I have to piggyback on that too. There's one speaker that I just love dearly, and her biggest point through the entire presentation, 1 hour of presenting, it's read the emails. And no matter what her point is, it's read the emails. And so by the time you get done, she makes a joke about it, but the legitimacy of like, you got to read the emails to stay informed of the organizational work that you are supposed to be governing, right? And managing at that higher level. If you don't read the emails and you're not in on the communication, how can you possibly be offering good governance?
Absolutely. And so you've talked very detailed about setting the expectation, communicating those bullet points. New nonprofits and nonprofits that want to grow. Recruiting is a crucial aspect of building the board. Many times we find that founders of nonprofits bring people on board because they like the mission, they like what's going on, but sometimes the harder decision nonprofit founders have to make is building the right board. So what can you talk about recruitment and filling the board with the right people at the right position? Elizabeth, would you like to kick that one off?
Sure. Well, it's interesting. Melissa and I were having a great conversation about this earlier. I think that really starting in that pre-planning stage that Melissa had referred to earlier, where you're doing some kind of matrix and you're assessing, and you want to be assessing different things, like what are the skills that are needed for your board? Like, do you need someone in law? Do you need someone in HR? But I would also say, like, look at your organization. What are the needs? Where are you failing? Where are the gaps? What's missing? And who could help with that right now? So that's one of the places you can definitely be looking. But as you begin to assess, like, I really love to look and I see, where do we have these clumps of people? Like, everybody's 45 to 60, everybody's Caucasian, everybody's in this one geographic area of the city. When you start to see that, it's so often in that recruitment process, we're looking and we start saying, oh, well, we've got this great board member and they brought their best friend and they brought their sister and they brought their book club member. And all of a sudden you've got a board who has the same network. They have the same ideas. Maybe other board members are afraid to speak up against them. It really creates a lot of problems. And so if you can look more broadly at your board, I mean, one of the things I found is if I have a board of too many introverts, suddenly my network isn't growing as a board. If I have a board that has everybody's visionary and nobody's detail oriented, you have great meetings and nobody follows up, right? So even just looking at those personality fits are really important. And how do you get a broad base of people in there?
Brilliant. Melissa?
I would add to that the one thing too, that, the first time I served as an ED, I had one board member, I respected him tremendously as a successful business person, but he told me that we were a nonprofit and that was different. And the reality is that nonprofits are a business classification, but they're still a business. And so I really do think that making sure you have some business-minded people on your board is incredibly important. I think, as Elizabeth mentioned, the geography, having different representation from all of the audiences you serve is incredibly important. And just continuing to really think about, I think she mentioned it as well, where are your gaps? Marketing, legal, finance, like really making sure you've got your bases covered, and then start succession planning too. If you've got programs you're running and maybe you need a certain type of coach or a specialty, maybe you need a certain age group range and somebody who's got children in that age range. And so really trying to play around with those details and just balance out your board the best way you can, adding diversity across the board. Again, making sure everybody's got a voice so that you are just really being fully representative of the community you serve is incredibly important.
Absolutely. So once you build that all-star board, how do we handle accountability and making sure that everyone lives up to the expectations that we've set forth?
So I think, I love doing a scorecard, and really what we do is when you've done your pre-work and you have those expectations laid out, then it's really clear and easy to have a checklist for each board member. We had one client that did a scorecard, and they passed the scorecard around at the board meetings to try to kind of generate some friendly camaraderie, some friendly competition, to try to make sure that people were seeing who was falling short, who was achieving success. And I will share here that it backfired. There were a couple of board members who felt that they had been contributing, but maybe it wasn't reflected on the scorecard, and should they just resign? So, the organization then turned how they manage that scorecard and started doing one-on-one follow-ups on a quarterly basis to give the board members just like a, hey, gentle nudge, here's how you're shaping up. Just wanted to make sure we're on the same page. Is there anything I'm missing? Do I need to add anything? And then doing a half year, check-in. And that way they have time to repair anything that's not where it needs to be. And everybody remains on the same page. And I also think, whether your bylaws have the steps to take if somebody's not meeting those expectations, or even in a retreat, I love to ask the board directly, how do you want to be held accountable? Because oftentimes peer to peer, they're going to have a harder expectation on themselves, and they're going to put out those parameters, and then you're just adhering to the guidelines they gave you. So you look less like the bad guy, if you will, and more like you're really just following through on what they asked you to do. So I call it co-creating, when you really work with them to create the policy and how your organization will do the follow-up.
I love that. And so they really set the expectations that they're holding themselves to, and you act as the facilitator of those expectations. Brilliant. Love it. Elizabeth?
Well, there isn't much I'd add to that, because I can tell that Melissa's better at that than I am. As we were preparing for this, one of the things I was talking about were scenarios in which we had situations in which either in the nominating and recruiting process or in the accountability process, somebody isn't living up to that. And I think, in this particular organization I'm thinking about, there was a lot of political relationships. So who was friends with whom, who had recruited somebody. And while somebody may not be the most effective board member, there were issues about asking that person not to come on or not to stay on because they were friends with a certain person. And I think that when we're talking about laying out these processes, it's like, how do you nip those problems in the bud, and how do you set those expectations with the other board members as they're recruiting, so that it is more transparent, it is more accountable, and it's less political, and it's less about who the friends are. So I think that is critical to that.
Well, and I would add on to what Elizabeth is saying to that point, right? The other item we were discussing is that sometimes you need to say no to the board members. The nominations, just because they've applied, too many nonprofits, if they've got a heartbeat and a pulse, they'll take them. And that's not going to necessarily get you where you want to go. So really, as part of your pre-planning, understanding what qualifications do you want them to have? And to Elizabeth's point, being able to have those qualifications outlined, and then having your board trained to understand what a good board member looks like, or an ideal, that starts to take you from good to great and really elevate your organization in a desirable way. Because sometimes you have to say no. And I think you can say no to some people in a very nice way of, I know, the example that comes to mind is where we've just told some people, you haven't had enough experience with the organization, so we'd love to see you serve on a committee for a year, and then let's revisit this, down the road, so that they can get more involved, they can understand the organization a little bit more, because when I think when a potential board member comes in and they go like from 0 to 60, you know, the top leadership position too fast, they really can tip the apple cart and just shake the balance of the organization in a less than desirable way.
And you really emphasized how, as leaders of a nonprofit, especially if you're a founder of a nonprofit, you have a heart for what you're doing. And so you want to collaborate with people that have that same sort of heart. And that's also why it's hard to say no, because you want everyone involved in your organization. And so being able to say no sometimes is a challenge, even though it is what is needed to get your organization to that next level. So I think that's an important skill. You also emphasized on training. So many times we focus on recruiting, but what are some of the best ways that you've experienced to train the board to be the board that a nonprofit needs?
So I would like to say I really transformed on this. This is something Melissa and I were talking about earlier too, is when I started, like I came up through fundraising. So for me, you know, I loved my board members. I loved having a good relationship. I met one of my old board members at an event, and she bought me a necklace from the salad auction. She was lovely, right? Like I just loved the people that were there. But a lot of times my interest in them was really strictly from a fundraising perspective. It's like, did they make their gift? Did they introduce the people? That's how I'm working with them, and then moving on. And as I've gotten to this part in my career and working with organizations, I've really come to see that if your board is not functioning at a high level, your organization isn't either. It doesn't even matter at some point if the dollars are coming in, because they're playing that strategic vision role. And if nobody is doing that for an organization, it's just, you're never going anywhere. It's like you're pedaling as fast as you can on the bike, and it turns out it's a stationary bike. So, where I've really started to see the ongoing training is an important thing. And I see it comes in a couple of different ways. One of the things I have learned the hard way is the importance of high expectations, that when you set high expectations and you bring in people who are interested in that, everybody is excited. People want to live up to that. They want to be that person, and they want to be with that group. And that becomes exciting. And that when you're providing ongoing training for your board, they're getting something out of their board experience. They're becoming better. They're with better people. The conversations are rich. And so I've started to find, like, I've gone from having my full day retreat with the board, and we're working on fundraising, we're learning, we've talked about governance. But, you know, within a couple of weeks, they're starting to go back to old habits. And I've really begun to see, like, this almost needs to be a quarterly thing. And we need to have these ongoing trainings and discussions. And you need to have a committee on your board that is looking at that for your board and saying, hey, how are we growing as a group? How are we being better for the organization? How are we being better for ourselves? And if you can create that environment, who doesn't want to be there? That would be amazing, right? Get excited.
You're adding so much value to those who are tuned in right now. What topics would you consider critical for training across the board, no pun intended?
Yeah.
Melissa, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, right, it starts with understanding the importance of that governance that Elizabeth highlighted in the beginning. I think that board members carry a really big role and responsibility in making sure that an organization maintains their nonprofit status by doing all the things they are expected to do at the state, city, federal levels, depending on where you're at and what the rules and requirements are. And so I think it really starts there. But I think that strategic visioning, I mean, Elizabeth touched on it, and you know, you always want to be doing a certain amount of your board work should be kind of on the ongoing current programming or current, you know, programs, but you've got to be doing that visioning. Elizabeth highlighted that earlier too, on the importance of some visionary members on your board, because you've got to be able to have the strategy to go forward. And that's what starts to take you from good to great, from great to amazing, and really elevate you. And I think too many organizations keep trying to do the same thing they've always done and get better results. But the reality is, if you want something you've never had, you have to do things you've never done. And so you've got to keep raising that bar.
Absolutely. So what are the qualities of a successful board? Elizabeth?
Ooh, so many. What's interesting is I've been digging deeper into this. What's coming up over and over again is really open and honest communication. So how do you have that communication within your board meetings, between the board and the staff, between board members, that you're willing to call out the things that aren't working, but you're also not squashing people's ideas, different ways of doing and creativity. And that's a real balance, because it can't just feel like we're all yes and everything is okay, because it isn't. And you can't be like, we've always done this, how dare you, right? So it's like there's this middle ground that I think can be actually hard to find. And when you're in it, it just feels easy and you have no idea how you're doing it maybe. But if you're not in it, you can tell, you can feel that you're out of alignment, that something isn't really working. Oh, this is that meeting where I never get to talk, or only the executive director's niece who's on the board gets to talk, right? Those are some real problems that are there. And so I think one of the big qualities is creating that open communication where it is safe to fail and be wrong, and to grow and grow and push and push.
Melissa, your thoughts?
Yeah, there are so many. I think board members, you need people who show up. They really need to be present. I think that they have to really be have a passion for your mission. I continue to think that if you may get somebody who's great on another board, and that doesn't mean they're going to shine for you the way they shine there if there's not a connection. And it's a different kind of alignment than what Elizabeth is talking about. But, that alignment's also important. You need board members who speak up. Again, they've got to have difficult conversations for the sake of the mission, and be in unison. You don't have to always be in agreement, but you've got to be able to have those difficult conversations for the sake of the organization and not take it personally. Don't think everything is a dig at you, but rather really looking at the fact that you are simply trying to make the best decision for the mission that you're serving. And when you all leave the room, no matter how much you disagreed or had different points of view, that when you leave and you've made a consensus, that you all respect and honor that consensus. I think that you also need to be able to have board members who understand the importance of the policies and the regulations. I think there's more and more policies coming into play these days around whistleblowing, and really what you do if there's a problem within the staff, like letting the staff do their thing, but also supporting the staff and making sure that there are policies and procedures for if there are problems that you can intervene and adapt. And then of course, you want board members that, I think, a successful quality, they got to have a good network, right? Because you really do want to be able to grow your awareness and bring in new connections, bring in new funders, and making sure they understand their role. And that is very important.
Absolutely. I love how you constantly lead to the next question. You're like, so, the pink elephant in the room is fundraising. Obviously, fundraising is a huge component of the board. It's what makes the mission go forward. It's not the only role, but let's talk about the role of fundraising and how can you balance that out and be more effective in fundraising in an organization. Elizabeth, I'm going to start with you on that. I know you've brought that word a couple of times.
I think there's a few things. Definitely, never underestimate training. We have to think about, if we have a corporate board, the people who are on that corporate board, they are there because they already have experience and they are paid to be there. And when we have our nonprofit board, they often do not have nonprofit experience, or they don't have fundraising experience. They don't know what to do, and they are not paid to be there. And so we really need to look at, when we get this board member, they may be smart, they may have marketing skills, they may have business skills, whatever. We still need to train them on that fundraising, and I expect them to know. They may be brave at sales and feel terrible asking their aunt for money, right? So we have to help them bridge that gap and get to that new place. So I think that's a big part of it, and creating those expectations. And I also say, one of my old bosses from, when I was young, she used to say, we put the fun in fundraising. So how do you make it fun? How do you make it encouraging? One of the things I like to do is I like to celebrate successes a lot. So if I'm sending out a weekly email, it's like, Joe brought in a $10,000 gift. Deanna, she brought in 10 new volunteers this week. So maybe 20 other people didn't do that. but they can get to see that over and over again. They get to see what that expectation is. They get to live up to that. They can say, well, I'm going to try, or maybe I'm going to try something else.
Absolutely. And when you emphasized on that, people have to remember fundraising. Yes, it's the dollars, but there's also relational capital that can be just as powerful. So bringing in those new connections can just break open the influence and the network that you have exposure to. So Melissa, you have significant experience with fundraising as well. How have you sort of propelled that mission within the different organizations that you've been part of, and how can people use that experience to drive fundraising within their current organizations?
You know, I like to try to make it easy for the board to help you. And I think, to Elizabeth's point, they don't know how to do that when they first come in. It's very foreign. I think some people are great connectors and some people are salespeople by trade. They just are very organic about it, but the majority of people are not. And so one of the things that I love to do, and that I have seen really help a lot of organizations, is that we do a simple, as part of our retreat annually at any project we're working on, is that we like to have a board lead sheet where we help them realize, like, who do you know? Because they all have a robust network and they know people they don't even realize they know. So, you know, we try to create a laundry list of, like, who are you looking for? Who makes a good candidate? So, you know, if you're looking for sponsors for a sports program, I mean, do you have a shirt company in town? Do you have, you know, a sports store in town? Like, who are the logical connections there? You know, your banks, your financial institutions almost always want to support. Maybe there's a big restaurant in town. So really starting to think about who you want on your wish list of sponsors, and then go to the board and say, does anybody know anybody at these companies? Or do you have other ideas? And do a little bit of a group brainstorm. And then we like to have people put down, okay, who in your network can you help connect us to? And one of the things we add onto that lead sheet is that we put, you know, I will make an introduction. Please feel free to use my name, or please do not mention me, because a lot of people know people, but they don't want to necessarily be the ones who, like, shared their information. And so we respect that on our projects. And by capturing those sheets, we do it in real time, even if the board member doesn't have all the details, but that gives us the brainstorm, and then we collect them and we can follow up with each board member individually to then say, hey, you mentioned this, can we get this introduction? Or can we go ahead and get this detail? Do you have their contact info that you can send over so I can make my outreach? And so it really starts to give you the right paper trail and set up your spreadsheet, and just kind of lead you down the road to be able to keep trying to nurture all of those relationships.
Absolutely. So I've done something very similar. We've called it the Vision 100. So, you know, creating that list of the 100 top businesses that you want to engage in your nonprofit is a great way not only to grow within your community, but to grow outward from your community as well. So I'm going to switch it up a little bit because of your robust experience. So I'm going to ask the fun one first and then the not so fun one second. So the fun one is, could you please share your most favorite board experience to date? Melissa, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I'm living it. So I am currently working with an organization that we worked with a few years ago when they were a mess. And, you know, there was no leadership pipeline. Most of the board members were not actually fulfilling their terms. You know, the board giver gets were, I mean, maybe we were hitting at 50% if we were lucky. And it is just really fun that, you know, actually in that particular organization, they had a leadership butting of heads that actually divided the organization. And so fast forward now, you know, 6-7 years later, and the pipeline for leadership is rebuilt. We actually have people not only are they serving out their terms, but they're serving repeat terms. For the first time in history, we actually had an immediate past president who signed up for an additional term because she could. And usually they're so tired after being president that they run for the hills. And they're having hard conversations. You know, they respect one another. They're having the difficult conversations, but they're really working through the lens of the organization's mission and vision. And that's how they're evaluating everything. They're keeping that mission front and center. They're not changing it year to year. You know, sometimes you get a new president in or a new executive committee and they want to change everything, but an organization shouldn't change that much, right? Like, you know, you think of a company, right? Kraft is still Kraft. Johnson & Johnson is still Johnson. I mean, they do what they do. They don't change it every year, and neither should a nonprofit. So if you have your mission and vision set, you know, you evaluate through that lens. And so watching this board really shine, they now are #1 in the country against other statewide chapters. They are seeing fundraising success. They are seeing, you know, new recruits come in at record numbers, and they are just on their way to setting some amazing records. They really understand. I mean, we haven't really talked a lot about servant leadership, but they understand that they're there to serve the organization and not themselves. And they're doing it in such a harmonious way that it's just beautiful to be part of it.
So I'm going to ask you one quick extension question. What was the game changer for that nonprofit?
Leaders who got it. You know, the ones who really, I think that this is part of knowing what you don't know. And when I started out in 1999 and all of my nonprofit experience, I didn't understand the value of running a company or running a business. And so now they have some serious entrepreneurs on their board that are, you know, working on financial reserves. They're working on more stability. They're working on what the succession plan looks like. And I think a strong organization can do more of that succession planning where you can hand off the playbook from one to another. You can document it. You can talk about what worked. You can talk about tweaks to level up, but don't reinvent. You should never be reinventing everything from, you know, one board to the other. And it goes back to Elizabeth's talk about training. That ongoing training is part of that. And I think that really has been the biggest change, and just the way they speak to each other, and the setting the expectation at the retreat and in the first board meeting that we're going to talk and we're going to have difficult conversations, and it's okay not to disagree, but we're one team here.
Oh, I love it. Elizabeth, share with us your favorite board experience.
Oh, that's great. So I just loved hearing Melissa's story here. For me, there's an organization I've been working with for several years, and I think maybe there's something with that common theme is that it does take time to transform your board. So for those of you listening, maybe feeling a sense of despair, it's not an overnight success, right? But I was working with an organization that when I was brought in to work and do some fundraising coaching with them, I was working with essentially who was the board president and a couple of board members because they had no paid administrative staff. They had paid program staff, but where that is unusual is it was a 20-year organization, 20 plus year. And so I really felt that there were things that were growing about the organization, but not in that way. And what I found early on is that the thing that was missing from where they are then to where they are now is it was a mindset change. That there was a martyrdom complex, which is, I think, very common in our industry. I don't know, maybe as much in sports, but I'd say overall in our sector, is a lot of martyrdom, right? And so there was this idea of kind of keeping your head down, working hard, oh, small little eyes, right? And I will just say, as like a recovered martyr, is that we get a payoff, right? When we're just like that long suffering person. I was like always first in the office, last one out, right? And the thing is, we keep ourselves small, we keep our organization small. And they had to realize that they were worth contributions. They were worth setting expectations with their board. They were worth asking more of themselves and more of each other and more of their board. And as it transformed by, it was year 2 maybe that they started paying their executive director, who had been full-time volunteer for several years. I don't know how that's even possible, but anyway, she was. And now at this point, they have hired more administrative staff. They are now looking at how do we pay more of our program staff so we get less turnover. We're now starting to set a different level of expectations with the board. And it's funny, as you reach new stages, it's now like, oh, now we have to do this with the board. Oh, now this is happening. But sometimes I'm like, hey guys, look back look at where you've come. We're at this new level. We have problems, right? And when you're at $15 million, you will have problems. And when you're at $150 million, you will have problems, but they're new, right? And we're always looking to grow and change and be better. So it just feels exciting to see where they've come and where they're going.
That is brilliant. So moving back to that question, I'm going to pass it back to you with the extension question. So what has been your greatest learning moment in your nonprofit career?
Ooh, that's tricky. I really want to think about that some more. I don't know. Do you have a good answer, Melissa, while I think through my stories? I'll have to, there's probably more than one, right? So I have to think.
Right. There's just so many. I mean, there's I think, right. Experience is just the best education. But I really think my very first board was hard. It was everything that a board should not be. And I was a first-time ED. I had no idea. I had an old school board. So the organization, right, I mentioned I had started there in 1999. The organization had been founded in 1946. They still had one of their original founders sitting on the board. The shortest term, so granted, it was a nice sized board. I like to believe myself that the ideal board size is somewhere between 10 and 13. I think after that, it almost gets too much to get things done. And so they had like the right number of board members. There was only one woman. They were all white. The shortest term of any of those board members was 10 years on that team. So, I mean, they were stale. They didn't have, their commitment was dried up. They wanted to do the same things they had always been done, but they were serving a community that was changing, and it was really gentrifying. And there was new, young energy coming in, and the young, energetic people were like, we don't want to do that stuff that they've always done. That's not even fun. Like, that's not a fun fundraiser. Why would we do that? And so it was really hard to start to get them to turn. They hadn't adjusted their bylaws. There were no term limits. So I just had no idea that everything was wrong coming into it, or I would have never taken that job. But, in 3 years, I mean, kudos to them that they were willing to listen. They were willing to kind of start to create that process. And so we revised the bylaws, we set term limits, we started getting new people involved. We had some breaks where, even you can have somebody on your board for a long, long time that can be a really strong asset. But even if they have to take a year off in between some of their, a maximum term service and then a year off and then come back. So they just have that freshness, because you need to keep looking. For the sake of your organization, you need to keep looking through new eyes and new experiences. And so I think it was a great learning experience, but if I had it to do over, I would have never said yes to that moment, that time. As it is, I'm grateful for that experience, because had I not started there, I probably wouldn't be where I'm at right now, this moment either. And I love the work I do now.
That's amazing. Sometimes those hardest mountains to climb create the most beautiful views. So
yeah, I like how you put that.
I think there's a great point you had in there, Melissa, where one thing I thought before but didn't mention is sometimes when we're stuck on having these same board members who've always been there, or we don't want to do it differently, I think sometimes we forget there's other roles for former board members, right? Mm-hmm. You can have an alumni board, you can have a special committee, you can honor them at the gala, right? They don't have to disappear. Like, they just don't always have to be on your board, right? You can love them, you can visit them for coffee every year, every quarter, so I think sometimes when people get really stuck, it's like, well, they're always on the board and they always have to, it's like, it doesn't mean we don't love them and honor them anymore. And so just something to remember with term limits.
And they can make great governance members, right? I mean, they of all people sometimes are great on a governance committee or nominations because they know what's expected or what's needed. So I find those are some really great ways to usher them and remind them how important those roles are.
Yeah, that's a really great point. If you're hearing laughter, it's because it's taco night at my house and there are children who are very happy. So I think going to that learning moment, I think the biggest thing that this has been like a 20-year learning moment is I am just such a recovering perfectionist. Like I have had to be like, I do everything myself. I do it well. Like nobody can tell me anything, right? Like I would just be my own worst client. And I think it's one of the reasons I love being in this business because, and being in the role that I'm in, is I want to go and rescue my 20-year-old self and say, it is okay. You do not have to work this many hours. You do not have to do all of this. You are probably doing projects that don't need to be done. And when I think about like how that relates to board, is what I really could have been doing is relying on my board in a different way. Like, I just want to say for all of us showing up our board members, making sure we have all our perfect documents and everything in place. Yes, you want to show up and look good, but you know what? You want to turn to that board member who's done a transformational process at their business and say, we don't do this well in our nonprofit. Would you lead this process here? We don't know. I don't know. Our turnover is a terrible rate. You know, can you write us an HR manual? Can you hand us this? And just be willing to be vulnerable and allow yourself to be contributed to in a way that you and your organization can grow. That was just something I wouldn't let anyone contribute to me because I had to be right. I had to be good enough. I had to do everything. And that's where I really see like I was holding myself and my organization back.
I think that collaboration is definitely so important. Being open to the gifts of the people that are on your board and the contributions and allowing them to fulfill themselves through that contribution will not only revitalize them and get them excited about what they can do, but that's where growth really occurs. So you're absolutely right. Sometimes as founders of nonprofits or people that have been on the board too long, we do allow ourselves to sort of get in the way of that process. And we have to have that mind shift that you mentioned. We have to be willing to let new blood in, and we have to be willing to understand that the mission, as long as it stays that central focus of what we're trying to accomplish, and that's driving the actions that we're doing, it's going to be okay if the napkins aren't this perfect color. It's going to be okay if this document is single spaced rather than double spaced. So giving ourselves permission to be imperfect, to allow us to fail forward, as it were, I think gives us the ability to overcome and give the opportunity for each person in the board to shine. And remembering it's about the mission, not about me. You've said that multiple times, both of you. So letting it be about the mission.
And I want to piggyback. I think that, I've got 2 points. So I think that one is, I usually, when I talk about volunteers and that role, they all want to make an impact. So if we're doing it all, they're going to feel unneeded. And that sometimes is when terms don't get fulfilled or they stop showing up. So, I think that's like the first thing I want to mention that I think Elizabeth's point on. But then the second thing too, we have an article that we released not too long ago about also building a list of your volunteer needs, like those tasks that maybe you can't ever quite get to. No, you really want to, but they're just too much. You can't focus. So that when a board member comes and says, I've got time to help, what do you need? I feel like most of us cannot produce a thought on the spot. And we're like, I don't know. And so to keep a running list, and then when somebody comes, say, these are the things I've been thinking about, which one would you like to tackle? And so being prepared for when you have help is also, I think, a good point.
Oh, I absolutely. And that goes into that planning and being prepared and not having to think on the spot. Absolutely. Having the directions of those things, and every nonprofit has them, even if it's, preparing for the next event or this, that, or the other, we get focused on the big idea, but it's taking the action on the things that move us forward that we overlook. Again, taking the board from the visionary, which is critical, to the action plan and getting it done. How would you advise the leaders that are listening to this today? How do we take it from vision to action?
I think that, it starts with so many checklists and documentation. And, really, I really, in listening to you kind of respond to my response, there's this concept around in the first part of my career, I was far more reactionary. There was never enough time. I was always chasing, my tail. I could never get it all done, let alone explain to somebody how to do it. And there's something that has happened with maturity and growth and time. And as I think about the 20-year learning curve that Elizabeth referenced, you start to realize that you set up the tools and the checklists and the outlines and the processes that make it easier for the next person. And then you're training because you took the time to detail it out the first time or that one time, then you just hand it off. And it's not as demanding on you to guide somebody else along with you on the journey. So I really think that, again, it keeps coming back down to planning. And when you're in it, and lots of times, right, many nonprofits don't have enough staff, so they are chasing their tail and they can't get it all done. And that's where, if you can have a volunteer shadow you, or if you have a good volunteer captain or committee chair, asking them to document their process, it will help you start to advance your mission in a much more desirable way.
And the concept of passing the torch, if the vision is to grow as an organization, the more people that serve with you, the more your organization will grow. So being able to pass the torch more quickly should be a really positive opportunity, again, to keep not only the existing and previous board members as part of the conversation, but giving new voices the opportunity to contribute and live as part of that mission statement is really a gift to your organization and the community.
And to that point, it also helps you evaluate future board members because, as somebody is handing off the guideline and how they can perform against that, you can decide if they're ready to advance to your board or not, and how they're going to contribute at the table if they can't manage a committee or whatever, or follow those rules and those guidelines too.
You also learn from that opportunity by being able to see someone else going through the same steps. That's how you can recycle and revisit. Is this the best way to do it? And that's also how we improve and grow, by being able to see someone else doing what you're doing. You're like, there's a better way to do this. And let's figure out how, and let's bring more people to the table in this conversation. So we are coming towards the end of our session. I do want to open up for final thoughts. So as we're talking about the experiences you've had, as we're talking about the ways that we can have impact on other leaders within other nonprofits to grow, what are some final thoughts, Elizabeth, that you would have to share with someone who's saying, I'm at this point and I need to know how to take it one step further, take it 5 steps further? What would you say to someone who's trying to grow their nonprofit, how the board can impact that, and how can it round out the organization to get them to where they're looking to go?
Yeah, there's a couple pieces in there that I would say. The first part is look for mentors, both inside and outside of your board. Those people that you can go and say, I don't know how to handle this. I don't know what to do about this. Talking to other organizations and other leaders, particularly if you can see, hey, they've got a great corporate sponsorship program and I've got a great volunteer program. Can we share this information with each other and we can both grow and be better? But I would also say that one thing I have learned, and when we talk about these early days of overwhelm in the nonprofit sector, is the most strategic thing you can do, or your board can help you do, if this is not how you think, is what are you saying no to is almost more important than what you're saying yes to. There are so many things that we feel are incredibly important. And I know when I was in those days of overwhelm and stress, I remember I was working on an event that made, a couple $1,000s compared to all the other things we were doing. We were only doing it because we always did it. I was stressed out. It was late. I was like, as I was doing it, I was saying, why am I doing this? But it was just, we were doing what we were always doing, and there was never time to think. And 5 minutes of extra thinking, give it to yourself in the morning, on the commute, or whatever, that you can say, what can we let go of? What can we stop doing? Not everything is important. So that.
Yeah, your stop doing list is just as important as what you're doing list. So that is critical, because we can overburden ourselves with the details that are not important. Melissa, what are your final thoughts? What would you like to share to those that are looking to grow?
You know, I was thinking about similar idea, but not the same language that Elizabeth used, in the concept of, you know, find organizations that are doing what you want to do well. And you know, I think there's more organizations and support out there now than anything when I started that I was aware of. And I think that there are online groups and there are just places in your community. If you see somebody thriving, you know, don't hesitate to pick up the phone and reach out. I grew up in a time where everything was about competition. And I just don't think that that serves people well. And I don't think that in the nonprofit space that most people are competitive people. We're all trying to do good. We're all trying to really make the world a better place in our own way. And so, you know, being able to reach out to somebody and ask for advice and input, it's not something to be you know, that I think is a bad thing. I think it's a really healthy thing, and it shows that you've got a growth mindset. And if you're not comfortable reaching out in your own town, or if you're in a small community, maybe, but then reach out to somebody in a neighboring community or in another state even. And, you know, just finding ways to kind of connect with somebody who might be doing what you're doing, or finding an association where you've got peers. I think that that's really incredibly important, and being able to have those peer-to-peer networks. I know at Big Buzz, even, we started a program last year called the Power Cell, and they're nonprofit masterminds, because nonprofit leaders, you have to be on all the time. You're on for your board, you're on for your donors, you're on for your staff, you're on for your program participants. But where do you get to drop the veil? When do you just get to be you in your moment of like, oh my God, I can't handle it today? Because it happens. We know it does. It's a lot. And so, you know, we find having these peer-to-peer groups has really worked well for a lot of people, because they need to have a safe space that they can come to regularly and share with one another who understands. So I encourage you to reach out to others and to be able to make those kinds of connections, so that you've got support on the rough days and you've got some really amazing cheerleaders on the good days.
That's really valuable. Thank you so much, Melissa. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. On behalf of Sports Philanthropy Network, we can't appreciate you enough for the wisdom that you shared on this call, the experience that both of you have, and just your perspective on the nonprofit space. Gave really great insight, not only to people who are well advanced in their nonprofit careers, but those just starting out. So ladies, thank you both. I want to give you a round of applause for being able to share your voice and share your wisdom. So thank you so much. And we hope to be able to continue the conversation either next year at Worlds, or you know, as we get the opportunity to collaborate and communicate again. Jonathan, I'm going to pass it back to you, sir.
Yep. No, I just wanted to thank you guys for speaking today. And yeah, that should be about it. I'm going to end the call unless you guys want to keep talking.
Thank you, ladies.
I just want to say thank you.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. It was wonderful to be part of the program. Thank you.
We appreciate all of you. Thank you. Take care. Thanks, Jonathan. Bye, Owen.
Bye.
Thank you, guys.